As we saw at the very beginning, there was a period in which they were performing better, but in general, he's going to say no.
The best of what? I mean, sometimes this gets inflated into the idea that they are some of the best warriors in history because the way their society works, etc. They were clearly not. They really struggled to ever achieve anything at all.
Excellent to show the ancient Macedonian army instead. That would have been professional. That's another one. Apart from the Romans that we mentioned, Macedonians would have been professional.
Against a professional army, such as the Macedonians or the Romans.
I'm glad he said that. Imagine if it was like, oh, and by the way, only the Romans would have been professional. Macedonians is another myth. And I'm like, God damn it. I would have left it in, though, just to get the truth out. I don't get if I'm the one who gets debunked or someone else. Misspeaking, you get debunked. That's fair.
They are not able to really make a stand against anything that takes military organization more seriously than they do.
Yep.
On the other hand, within the world of the Greek city-states, where a lot of people didn't really prepare for war and were really only serving when they were called up, the Spartans had a few minor ways in which they organized and prepared their army a little bit better than other Greek states, which came through their upbringing and their exercises in peacetime, as well as the principles that they applied once the army had gathered for war. So there are a couple of organizational principles, an officer hierarchy, a unit breakdown, and a couple of features of Spartan discipline and obedience that made them a little bit better at fighting pitched battles, and they used that to good effect. This made them, on average, more effective in battle than other Greeks when they were fighting.
On average being the key.
Together, but individually there was nothing special about Spartans, and no Greek ever thinks that a Spartan is a better warrior, man for man than other Greeks. This is really just about the way the Spartans organized their army in the classical period after the Persian Wars, and it gave them a slight edge that allowed them to win a number of pitched battles. That is the entire foundation of their reputation. They were not the best warriors of anything, but they were briefly a little bit better than other Greeks at least.
Man, this guy's good. You were right. This guy's really good.
How did the Spartans train? This is an interesting one because it's something that I think a lot of modern people are very exercised about. Like, how can we try and figure out this training? Can we replicate it? What can we do with that? The fact is we do have a number of descriptions of the Spartan upbringing, which survive from the ancient.
I love the long hair, by the way. As a long-haired man, I love the fact that Spartans did have long hair. Unless the expert debunks that too. But for what I've read in the sources, they did have long hair and they were proud of it. The only reason why I would know that is because I'm a long-haired man. So I did research that one.
Ancient sources. They don't always agree, but at least we know a little bit about it. But we don't know very much about their training. We just know that from everything that we can tell, it's purely athletic. So Spartan training is just running, jumping, discus throwing, javelin throwing, wrestling, boxing, the kind of things that the Greek did to prepare for things like the Olympic Games,
I mean, it makes sense because it will increase your endurance. Endurance is massive when it comes to marching, particularly if it's a long field battle, just performing at your best, it is massive.
Kind of contests that they did among each other. The Spartans trained this way in order to exercise their bodies, in order to increase their fitness, in order to make themselves better prepared for the hardships of campaigning.
Yeah.
But that is essentially the sum of their training. They didn't do any weapons training. They don't seem to have performed any formation drill until the armies were gathered. So this is a few days before they march out to war, perhaps, if that. And so the sum of their training...
Man, from a Roman perspective, that would have been so noob. Literally. Ask any Roman military man.
Is essentially just fitness and endurance. So this gets really distorted in a lot of understanding of the Spartan training. They think that this is very militarized. People tend to portray this as being constant training for war, constant training with weapons, but it wasn't that precisely aimed. The purpose of this training and the purpose of their education was to make sure that these people were ready to serve their community when they were called upon. So making sure they're fit so that they can serve in war, but also making sure they are obedient so that they follow orders, and making sure they respect the traditions and values of Sparta so that when they make political decisions as well as personal decisions, they follow the norms and values of their society. And this was the main thing of the Spartan upbringing, is making them not into perfect warriors but into perfect citizens, making them good little Spartiates who are going to perpetuate the traditions. That's basically what Spartan training is for, and it's much less involved, or even not at all involved, with learning how to be a good fighter.
Combat.
Next.
What's up with that music, by the way?
Question: did the Spartans throw babies off cliffs?
I think that's a myth.
We don't know, but probably not. There's only one source that tells us that they did. It's a very late source. It's the Roman historian called Plutarch, or a historian who writes in the Roman period. He is the only one to ever mention this, about 600 years after the Spartans had their most prominent period. And no other contemporary source ever says this. And we do hear about disabled Spartans actually getting to grow up and live full lives. So we hear about Spartans.
It could be that it's something that they did at one point in the archaic period. They discontinued it, maybe like 1 or 2 generations. And so since it was such a staggering thing, then it remained. And then the Romans hear it and then he repeats it. But then again, I do believe that the Romans did fact check. I absolutely believe that. So that's why I'm even giving the benefit of the doubt that maybe it did happen and the Romans just heard some sources that they thought would have been valuable, like sources you can believe in, but it's also possible it was completely a myth. That's also possible. That's what I think.
Who were apparently not thrown off cliffs. So the implication is very likely it actually wasn't a practice at the time when Sparta was at its height.
Yeah.
It may have been brought in later to complement other eugenic practices, but it probably wasn't a feature of their everyday life. They certainly didn't expect that this was going to happen to them.
Well, if he thinks it was later, I was postulating the possibility that it was archaic. If he thinks it's later, then, I mean, he's the expert.
They, if they had a child that turned out to be deformed or had some kind of disability, there was no understanding that this was a habitual thing that the Spartans did. Did the Spartans practice eugenics? Yes, so eugenics in a certain form. So this idea of trying to breed a better kind of Spartan, they'd certainly had various practices and laws that were intended to be eugenic. But they were not eugenic in a more modern sense where people tried to figure out who has the best genes or the best traits and then try to breed them in this very dodgy sort of early 20th century experiment. But rather in a way that reflects the scientific understanding of the age. So for instance, they believed that if both man and woman were strong, so physically trained and physically fit, then their children would also be stronger. So this is why they made women practice gymnastics as well, where they made them go and run and do other kind of
makes sense. I mean,
sports before they were married, so that they would be fit around the time they were married. And this is also why supposedly they kept young newlyweds apart. So they made sure that it was difficult for the man to see the woman, to visit the woman, for a newly married man to visit his wife, because they believed that if he had limited access to her, and if they were both really sort of filled with pent-up desire, that they would have more vigorous sex and that therefore their children would be more energetic and stronger. These are the kind of beliefs that the Spartans had. And so they're technically eugenic in the sense that they were trying to find the best possible matches and then trying to create the ideal conditions in which these would result in strong children. But they actually weren't really so sure about how genetics, well, obviously they had no concept of genetics. They weren't necessarily sure about how you actually go about this. There are some examples where they have more concrete interference in the way that Spartans formed families. So for instance, one king who supposedly married a woman who was very short was reprimanded by the ephors, by the officials, because they said that he would have small children, he would have short children. So there was kind of an understanding that Spartans were supposed to marry in ways and seek connections, seek sexual relations.
And if you think about it, even though they may sound like, oh, that's so bad, because why couldn't the king marry whoever he loves? But then again, even in the medieval period, you think like the princesses and princes and the son of a duke, they could marry for love? I mean, that's one of the things. If your daughter, it's kind of a funny meme, but if your daughter asks you, hey, dad, treat me like a princess, then from a historical standpoint would be to marry her to the son of a powerful foreign kingdom in order to strengthen your military alliances.